Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Dyer, and you're listening to a reading of The Guardsman Party by Shaggy. Link to the full story will be in the description. I hope you enjoy. And as always, stay alive out there. Doc was in his element. Well, actually, he was in the occurrence borders medbay and up to his elbows in the guts of a very unhappy armsman, but same difference. All around him, people were shouting, screaming, generally running around in a blind panic, and he was calm, little center of the universe. Doc hummed to himself as he dug around, and then let out a shout of triumph as he finally found the foreign object. It looked to be a large metal rivet, and still tingled with traces of the burst of warp energy which had propelled it. He neatly tossed it into the prayer-sealed covered bin marked tainted, and began closing everything back up. As Doc moved on to his next patient, he allowed himself a moment of pride. Despite his complete lack of official medical education, he liked to think that he was the master of it when he came to meatball surgery. He shot a glance across the room towards where the chief medical officer, Sister Valerie of the Ordos Hospitaller, was dealing with the non-trivial patients. Their eyes met for a second, and Doc smiled as he looked back down to inspect his new patient's severed arm. Then, a painfully shrill screech rose from the waste bins, and the lights and gravity both cut out, and the medical cogitator in the back of the medbay began frantically beeping. Doc automatically turned his shoulder tack light on, snatched the now floating severed arm out of the air, and instructed his patient to keep a hand on it, and drew his sidearm. The minor demon that clawed out of the medical waste bin, already weakened by the prayer seals, was dispatched with a single volley from Doc's las pistol. That minor annoyance dealt with, he disengaged his mag boots and launched himself towards the back of the medbay. Sergeant Gravis of the Emperor's Scythe Space Marines, or more specifically the upper half of Sergeant Gravis, twitched as the tyrannid bioweapon in his veins made another spirited attempt to kill him. The medical cogitator hooked to him requested several types of antidote, which Doc quickly administered. We're down to a last vial of hydroxycobalamin. And he's having nightmares again, reported Doc. Sister Valerie didn't look up from her patient as she responded. The warp's a bad place to be comatose, especially this far from the light of the Emperor, and the way that unholy Xenos abomination is tearing apart the ship doesn't help. He's not the only one who will die if we don't return to normal space soon, either. I swear, honey. Ma'am, Sarge said we'll be reaching the way station today. Then we can request all the aid and supplies we need. Just a little longer, and it'll all be over. As Doc finished stabilizing the Space Marine and made his way back to the table he'd been working at, the medbay's lights reactivated. A second later, there was a clattering crash as the various small items that had floated through the air dropped back to the floor. There was also a meaty thump as Doc's neglected patient was slapped by his own severed arm. Sister Valerie watched for a second as Doc hastily apologized to the maimed crewman and scrambled under the table for his dropped limb. In a voice too quiet for even the nurses to hear, she muttered, Emperor, why do you have to be an optimist? The All-Guardsman Party, Interdlude, Dewarp. Amelia de Lorista Animata Trigestara Zeldana Malefi von Humperdinck was on the hunt. The creature that had been haunting the aft-tainted areas and attacking unwary crewmen and servitors had eluded them for days, but now she finally had it. Amy readied her pulse rifle as her bait slowly advanced into the disused cargo bay and her spotter scanned the area. It was a perfect example of the classic monster hunting technique, or it would have been if the bait stopped whining. I don't see why always gotta be debate, whined and whinged Nubby. I think the destroyer unfair. I think it's unfair. Amy didn't respond, but her goggle-clad spotter suggested it wasn't discrimination. Nubby just needed to stop picking rock every time. Nubby's complaints rose in volume as he began arguing with Fumbles over the rules of a game older than the Imperium of Man. It's not right how paper beats rock, wrapping around it. Where's the sense in that? Still a rock, ain't it? Just with paper and stuff. Things got even louder when Twitch calmed in and began explaining that the game was actually a metaphor for the relationship between the Ecclesiarchy, Administratum, and Mechanicus. Eventually, the argument was cut short as Amy lost her patience. A few inventive and highly personal death threats later, the team fell back into silence, and Nubby got on with it. "Oh, woe is me, I'm a poor fenceless ooman, and what? All is lost, and I lost me way, 'ere in a big spooky cargo bay. I sure hope there's not some sort of, tentaculated warp monstrosity lurking down here waiting to eat me." Fumbles peered into a dark corner of the bay as Nubby monologued. He could sense a malevolent presence that just barely qualified as a mind, moving closer, and pointed it out to Amy. The markswoman sighted her rifle on the corner and waited for the creature to make its move. "Still not sure what it is, Fumbles," the psyker sheepishly shook his head. "Well, it can't be that smart if it's falling for this," Amy gestured towards the soliloquizing bait. "Though I gotta say, his performance is better than usual. The wig and the dress are a nice touch." Fumbles nodded in agreement. "He says they help him get into character. It really says something that I don't find this conversation even remotely weird." Fumbles just shrugged. And there was a brief silence as Amy shifted mental gears. "You know, my life was really quite boring before I joined the Inquisition. Mother never let me go on the lines where there was something really interesting to shoot." Amy felt a pang of longing that definitely didn't originate from her. "Sounds nice. Wish I had parents," muttered the psyker. Amy glanced up from her scope. "You can be really fucking depressing, you know?" "Sorry. Whatever. You got any idea why this thing isn't coming out? Does it know we're here?" Fumbles pondered the question before answering. "No, I think it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Amy was interrupted by a sudden pain in her head, a panic scream from Fumbles, and then sudden absence of both light and gravity. In the completely dark cargo bay, Nubby's well-honed survival instincts kicked into overdrive, as first 1, then 2 dozen chittering screeches rose around him. Before Amy had even reoriented herself, at the bedressed little trooper, screaming shrilly and propelled by the recoil of his pulse carbine, shot past and slammed into Fumbles. Nubby, dragging the semi-conscious Fumbles with him, started bouncing his way down the corridor with the speed provided by his augmetic legs, leaving Amy struggling to catch up. As she flew, Amy shined her rifle's tack light back towards the cargo bay and saw the forms crawling along the floor, walls, and ceiling. She started firing her rifle just for the little bit of extra speed, then screamed, "Plan B," into her combine. At the far end of the corridor, Twitch smiled. When the ship's lights reactivated a few minutes later, they revealed a shrapnel-pocked corridor filled with a disgusting cloud of limbs and juices. Twitch reopened the door the 4 of them had sheltered behind and surveyed the carnage. As Amy drifted over to join him at the doorway, Twitch felt something shift and flung himself behind the markswoman. A second later, the gory mess hanging in the corridor dropped out of the air with a horrible splash. Amy spluttered and swore. Nubby laughed, and Twitch peeked around his human shield. Sure that the coast was clear, the demolitions trooper crept forward. He poked at the horrible slurry, carefully pulled a large chunk out of the mess, and started giggling. Nubby took a break from checking Fumbles' health, using the tried and true Guardsman technique of gently kicking him in the ribs while muttering, "He's okay?" to ask Twitch what was so funny. Twitch turned a manic smile on Nubby. "These were demons! I swear, if you tell us they were orcs, I will cram your delusional head so far up your ass," growled Amy. Twitch bristled at this. "I don't always say it was orcs." "Yeah, you do," inserted Nubby. "Well, I'm not saying it's orcs this time." Amy picked an especially large chunk off her armor. "Good, because if you've just covered me in orc guts again, I'll have to kill you." "Death threats aside, I thought Fumbles established that these were demons. Ain't that right, little buddy?" Nubby's metal foot prodded Fumbles again, eliciting a pained groan. He says yes. Twitch responded by yanking Nubby away from the suffering psyker and shoving the limb he'd acquired into the trooper's face. Nubby went cross-eyed as he stared at the razor-sharp limb, then swore. Amy came over and swore too. After a brief silence, Twitch spoke. "We gotta call Sarge." "He's not gonna like this," muttered Nubby. Not it, echoed Twitch. "Blarf," added Fumbles. Amy glared at them, then keyed Sarge's channel. Deep inside the spacefaring pile of scrap known as the Occurrence Border, there is a circular room filled with arcane machinery. In the middle of this room is a bubble of blue light which contains a large Xenos that resembles a cross between a snake and a nightmarish fetus. The Xenos is the type of potent tyrannid psyker known as a zoanthrope, which was captured in a daring Space Marine-assisted raid and is now being transported to an inquisitorial laboratory for study. The imprisoned zoanthrope is being completely stilled by a stasis field, but its sheer psychic presence distorts the world around it, and acts as a beacon to the denizens of the warp. The clutched-together psyker containment area is straining to shroud the Xenos' presence from the demons surrounding the ship and limit the power of the creature's mind. Every single subsystem is out and on the ragged edge of failing. Some are sparking, others are smoking, and the stasis unit itself is emitting an ominous hum that steadily is rising in pitch. Two men, one a filthy guard uniform, and the other sporting a robe and augmetics of the Adeptus Mechanicus and a tau of the Earth-cast variety, are running around in a constant effort to repair the containment area's failing systems. A third man, whose uniform and bearings scream NCO, is standing directly in front of the zoanthrope and holding what appears to be a piece of hull plating, like an oversized shield. The shield bearer is Interrogator Greg Sargent, and he is not having a good day. Sarge tightened his grip on the massive shield as the stasis unit's humming reached a painfully high pitch, then went out of the range of human hearing. After a few 10 seconds, there was a loud, deafening clang, and the blue field around the zoanthrope disappeared. It was immediately replaced by a corona of green electricity, which gathered in front of the Xenos as it turned to face the frantically working Theo. With a scream of effort, Sarge hefted the shield and sprinted across the room, barely managing to intercept the bolt of lightning in time. Without a second of hesitation, the zoanthrope began gathering another bolt of electricity and twisted around to face the opposite side of the room. Sarge lifted his smoking shield for another sprint, but let it drop back down to the floor as the stasis field snapped back into existence. Behind him, the squat Tau scientist complained that Sarge was standing in his light. At the sound of Sarge grumbling about the ungrateful little Xenos bastard, Tink looked up from the mess of wires he was digging through. "Oh, nice catch, boss. We'd be all dead without you. Truly, you're a masterful at standing in front of things. Now, since you're just standing there, can you grab me another handful of triplex connectors? Next flicker should be in about 3 minutes. You've got time." Sarge glared at the techie, but set down his shield and headed off to get the requested parts. On the far side of the room, Chief Engineer Jim leaned out from behind a glowing blue pylon and angrily waved a mechadendrite. "Damn it, Tink, no more triplex connectors. They anger the machine spirits. Stick to duplex," Tink scoffed. "Machine spirits, my ass. They work fine." "Come on, Theo, back me up on this." The Tau responded without looking up from his work. "There's no scientific reason triplex connectors shouldn't work. They're completely compatible with duplex systems and are, in fact, rated for much higher capacity. See?" Jim returned to his work with a few mutters about poor, abused machines, and Sarge delivered the controversial parts. As Sarge hefted his massive shield and got into position, the stasis unit began making its ominous humming again, and Tink rushed to finish his repairs. With a shout of triumph, he reconnected the final component and slammed the panel shut, and ran over to the control panels lining the room. The mental pressure everyone in the room had been feeling quickly decreased. Sarge let out a sigh of relief, Tink cheered again, and Theo asked if anyone could smell smoke. A second later, the panel Tink had just shut was flung across the room by a small explosion, and the mental pressure returned with a painful intensity. From behind his pylon, Jim shouted, "I told you they don't like triplex!" While the three techies ran around in a panic, Sarge stood still and watched the stasis unit. He looked down at his shield, up at the green aura that was gathering around the zoanthrope despite the temporarily functional stasis field, and then back down at the shield and reached a decision. Silently counting to himself, Sarge raised the massive slab of metal over his head. Sarge didn't wait for the zoanthrope to make the first move. As the stasis field cut out, he flung the heavy thing with all his beefy non-com strength and dove for cover. There was a clang, followed by a zap, a thwomp, and then a massive crackling boom. For a split second, the room was lit by a blinding green light, and then everything went dark. Sarge hung in the air at the apex of his jump, and blinked in the pitch darkness. He wondered if he'd finally gotten himself killed, and whether the afterlife truly involved fighting by the Emperor's side, or if Twitch was right about it just being a poker room. Then he crashed into the ceiling, and the ringing in his ears faded into Jim screaming at Tink about how he caused a ship-wide power outage with his damned triplex connectors. Since he was apparently still alive, Sarge decided it was a good idea to stay that way and turned on his tack light. He tried to twist around to face the zoanthrope, but this turned out to be rather difficult since the stasis unit was now empty. After a brief period of panic, Sarge realized that the lack of green lightning bolts meant that the Xenos wasn't currently up for a fight and began carefully scanning the room. Remembering the meaty thunk he'd heard after throwing the shield, Sarge aimed his light at the far side of the room. It revealed a horrible form made of chitin and metal hanging in the entrance of the debris-clogged cell. A closer look revealed it to be the zoanthrope, except with a partially melted shield wrapped around its head. Sarge floated over and scientifically poked at it with his gun, took its feeble twitching as a good sign, and began hefting the Xenos out of the cell and back towards the stasis unit. While Sarge wrangled the zoanthrope back into place, Tink, Jim, Theo climbed around the incredibly deep hole that occupied Sarge's former position. From the bottom, Theo could be heard complaining that whoever had installed the wiring in his section had not been SEPT-certified electrician. Jim, who was patching up cables slightly higher up, suggested that the person had probably been either drunk or insane or both. At the top of the hole, Tink reconnected a group of wires with a few duplex connectors, and nearly wet himself when the tangled mess started sparking and the room terminal chimed. At the sight of familiar contact code on the screen, Tink launched himself out of the hole and flew over to the terminal, ran a hand through his filthy hair, straightened his goggles, and oh so casually answered the incoming call. "Hey, Hannah, what's up, baby?" Sarge heard the enraged screeching from across the room, but couldn't make any words aside from stupid and insane. Tink continued undeterred. "Why would you assume I have anything to do with this? Is it because you're always thinking of me?" This time, the screeching was accompanied by a short arc of electricity. Cursing and clutching his burned ear, Tink floated away from the terminal and then crashed to the ground next to the hole as gravity and light returned to the cells. After a feeble attempt to climb to his feet, the techie gave up, leaned over the side of the hole, and groaned, "Hey, Jim, your sexier counterpart is being all bitchy. You can talk to her." While Jim climbed out of the hole and began giving a damage report to Hannah, Sarge pushed the zoanthrope back into the network of grav plates above the stasis unit. Once he was certain the now metal-faced Xenos wasn't going anywhere, Sarge grabbed Tink up off the floor and over to the non-functional stasis unit. A few clicks and kicks and death threats convinced the techie that getting the stasis field back up was more important than eavesdropping on Jim's conversation, and the two guardsmen got to work. Right as the last fixes were being made, Sarge's comm bead came to life with the sound of Doc's slightly panicked voice. "Hey, Sarge, the captain's been trying to reach you over the ship's comm. He says we're there." With a rare smile, Sarge relayed the good news to his comm beadless Tink, who practically collapsed with relief and leaned toward Sarge's headset. "Oh, thank the Emperor! Doc, tell him we'll be ready in 5 minutes." On the far side of the comm bead, Doc's voice grew a little panicked. I don't think you've got 5 minutes. I think he means that we're there, as in we're dewarping right now." Sarge winced as Tink ripped the comm bead out of his head and began screaming into it. "What happened to our warning, Doc? I was promised a 15-minute warning." "How should I know?" responded Doc. "I'm just passing the word along. All I know is that the captain said your room's comm is busy and asked me to try to reach you." "Well, that's not my fault." Tink shot a glare towards the room's comm terminal, where Jim was chattering about catastrophic system damage with Hannah, and then returned his attention to the comm bead. "And why didn't he just call us like you did?" Doc's tone shifted from panicked to annoyed. "Maybe because you helped Twitch encrypt all of our comm beads the day before yesterday. That was to keep the Cog Boys from spying on us, and he said it would share the code with everyone who needed it." There was a brief pause as Doc digested this. Then the medic exploded. "You thought he'd share the code? This is Twitch we're talking about, you idiot. Of course he didn't share it with anyone." Tink began putting together a suitably scathing response, but was interrupted as Sarge wrenched the comm bead back, spun him around to face the psi suppressor. Taking time over. Fixing time now. Move it, trooper. Move! Move! Once he was sure Tink was back on task, Sarge turned his attention to Jim. Using his refined oratory and leadership skills, he convinced the tech priest that repairing the cell's various delicate systems before the stress of dewarping blew them into shrapnel took priority over helping Hannah with the ship's power problems. Which is to say, Sarge reached over to Jim's shoulder, terminated the call, then picked up the hapless engineer by the crimson robes and flung him towards Tink with a shout of, "Fix stuff before it explodes!" As the two techies scrambled, and Theo asked what was going on and if anyone could help him out of a hole, Sarge entered the bridge's contact code into the comm terminal. Unfortunately, his plan to yell at the captain for attempting to get them all killed ran into problem when the ex-Navy officer answered the call with a bellow of, "Why is my navigator unconscious, Sarge?" Back in the aft of the ship, Amy's comm bead nearly deafened her as it finally connected to Sarge's. After a few attempts to make herself heard over her boss's shouting match, she removed the earpiece and turned to her companions. "I think he's busy. Apparently we're all about to die." Nubby, who was seated on Fumble's curled-up form, paused in rummaging through a medkit that appeared to be filled with nothing but glow sticks and suspiciously unlabeled bags of pills. "Huh, neat. Anyone want to smoke?" Behind him, Twitch reacted a little more strongly, leaping to his feet with his rifle in one hand and grasping for something inside of his jacket with the other. "I knew it! Have we been boarded? Who's coordinating the defense? Should I blow the ship's plasma reactor before—" His tirade was cut off by Nubby, who yanked the detonator out of his hand and began dancing backward down the hall with it. Amy listened a little longer, then called after the pair. "No boarders, but he's arguing with the captain about whether to stay in warp and risk the navigator getting possessed or dewarp and potentially blowing the cells." Nubby paused for a second. "Speaking as someone who's nowhere near the cells, I vote for that one." Twitch seized on Nubby's distraction and made another grab for the detonator, but Nubby managed to spin away and crammed it down between the two wads of dirty socks holding up the front of his dress. This did not deter Twitch even slightly. Amy gagged a little and Fumbles laughed weakly as Twitch tackled Nubby to the ground and began rooting around for the detonator. As Twitch finally found his prize and withdrew it, along with a handful of crusty socks, a deep vibration came up through the floor and the Vox system began blaring with completely incomprehensible automated dewarping warning. Amy raised her comm bead back to her ear, Twitch and Nubby both cheered, Fumbles began whimpering again, and back in the gore-filled hallway, something moved. Tink and Jim worked feverishly. In the background, the automated dewarp warning instructed all hands to hold still and pray to the Emperor in 36 different variations of Gothic, not to mention Janthi, Bidlecant, and what the resident xenologist insisted was Hrud. Until Sarge used his carbine to deactivate the nearest speaker. The noise of the dewarp warning was replaced by the pops of overloading psi suppressors, Theo's demands to be told what was happening, and the sound of Sarge yelling at the captain to slow down. Inside the inactive stasis unit, unnoticed by everyone, the zoanthrope began twitching. Doc threw himself across the medbay as Sergeant Gravis went into double cardiac arrest. While he struggled to fight the increasingly active Tyranid bioweapon, the deep vibration of the ship's warp drive grew stronger and stronger. Amy, Twitch, and Nubby all flinched as the sensation similar to fiberglass being rubbed on exposed nerves shot through their heads, and automatically turned to face Fumbles. Amy got as far as, "The fuck is wrong with you now?" before she noticed the way the gore in the corridor had begun to bubble and froth. With remarkable coordination, the three troopers seized Fumbles and started retreating down the now wildly shaking corridor. Then, right as they reached the next door and turned back to see what they were running from, the vibrations stopped with a colossal, tooth-rattling clunk. Twitch swore, Nubby screamed, Fumbles started twitching madly, and Amy looked around in confusion. She got as far as, "What the fuck?" before all the gore, including the portion soaking into her armor, suddenly ran together and reformed into a familiar insectoid shapes in the sort of reverse explosion. All three troopers immediately opened fire. As the clang reverberated through the medbay, Doc went pale. Sister Valerie met his gaze from across the room and began to ask what the but her question was interrupted by the ragged edge of Gravis's torso inexplicably bursting into green and black flames. Sister Valerie abandoned her current patient and sprinted towards Gravis as Doc screamed, "This is not how poison is supposed to work," and grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall. As the echoes of the clang died away, Tink leaned out of cover and that he had jumped into when the psi suppressor had been working on exploded. "What the fuck was that?" asked the shaken techie. Jim didn't respond, rather being busy rocking back and forth and whimpering to himself, and Theo rather crossly asked how someone stuck in a hole was supposed to know anything about what was going on. Sarge raised his carbine with a mutter of, "Oh, not this shit again," and began scanning the room. Behind the comm terminal chimed another person joined the call, and the husky old voice of Old Bill temporarily overrode the captain's demands for information. "Hey guys, know you're busy screaming at each other and all, but we've got something big and psychic holding us in the warp. Either of you seen any major demons running around, or is this just your darn bug again, Sarge?" Sarge focused on the twitching zoanthrope and took a step forward. "I think it might be the Xenos Psyker snapped its metal-covered face towards him, surrounded itself in a halo of green and black electricity, and a tide of insects began pouring out of every crack in the room. "It's definitely the bug!" shouted Sarge. Sarge dropped his carbine onto its sling and sprinted for the stasis unit, crushing insects under his boots as he ran. For a second, the room around him seemed to stretch and warp, but it stopped as Jim snapped out of his funk and plunged his mechadendrites into one of the psi suppressors. Several small bolts of green and black electricity grounded on Sarge as he finally neared the stasis unit, but he ignored them and triumphantly flipped the big switch to on. Nothing happened. Sarge frantically flipped the switch up and down, screamed, "I thought we fixed this, Tink!" Tink slammed into the unit next to him, slapped his hand away, then set the switch to on, and responded with a forced comm, "Had to replace the capacitors to fix the flicker. They needed to char." Tink's calm tone evaporated as he began slapping at the insects that had just crawled up his pants leg. Sarge sprang to help, then noticed the way the insects were flowing towards the open maintenance panel on the stasis unit. He immediately began employing his big stompy boots in an effort to stem the tide, screaming at Tink as he did so. "Why didn't we turn it back on after we fixed it?" Because we're idiots, Sarge," responded the techie, as his frantic dancing finally dislodged the last bug and he joined Sarge in stomping on the onrushing swarm. Even with two sets of boots, it was obviously a losing battle, but being guardsmen, neither of them commented on this. They continued in their desperate attempt to hold the line as the tide surrounded them and began climbing both their legs and the stasis unit. Across the room, Jim noticed their predicament and, in a fit of genius, scrambled over to Theo's hole. He very calmly asked the Tau to redirect extra power from the damage suppressor to the stasis unit. There was a flash of blue light behind Sarge and Tink, and both of them collapsed as the universe twisted in what felt like a million barbed legs ripped across their minds. For the second time that day, Sarge wondered if he'd been killed. But as the empty ringing in his head was replaced with what felt like the universe's worst hangover, he decided that he was probably still alive. He just wished he wasn't. Moving with the extreme care of someone with a near-terminal headache, Sarge sat up and looked around the cells. Surprisingly, things looked more or less stable. The bugs were gone, though his legs felt like they'd been worked over with a wire brush, and a certain feeling in his gut told him the occurrence boarder had finally exited the warp. It seemed that without the strain of traveling through the hellish realm and the few still functional psi suppressors were holding up fine. Well, as far as he could tell, they were fine. At least none of them were on fire, or whatever Tink had done to the stasis unit that fixed the damn flicker. Sarge eyed the stationary zoanthrope and its creepy new metal-covered face, then flipped it off and turned his attention to his team. Tink was curled up nearby, clutching at his head and alternating between crying and swearing. Jim was already back on his feet and doing tech priest things, and Theo had finally hauled himself out of the hole in the floor. The annoying little Xenos looked rather confused about what had happened, but had enough self-preservation instinct to go help Jim, instead of bothering Sarge or Tink with questions. Sarge decided that the situation was stable enough for the time being, and carefully lowered himself back down onto the floor, only to be jerked upright as something drove a red-hot poker into his head via his ear. He frantically reduced the volume on his comm bead until the voice coming through it changed from a horrible demonic screech, made of pure agony, to Doc's rather worried tone. "Are you alive, Sarge?"
Sorta."
Sarge flinched as Amy's considerably louder voice joined the conversation. "What the hell happened down there?" "Tink broke something," muttered Sarge as a half-hearted glare from the prone techie. Tink stopped moaning about his head and dug through his gear, pouring through his comm bead, whining to himself as he searched.
"It's not my fault the fucking machine spirits are being stupid little bitches. There's no bloody scientific reason for it."
Sarge returned his attention to his comm bead and summoned as much professionalism as he could manage.
"Everyone's still alive? Report."
"I'm fine, and Gravis is still alive, if a bit crispy around the edges," replied Doc. Amy spoke next. "We're all okay, but the thing hunting down people in the aft tainted area turned out to be a swarm of gaunts." Sarge winched. "Oh, shit." Amy began to continue, but Twitch's voice, which sounded dangerously excited to Sarge's experienced ear, overrode her. "I was ready for that, though, and we blew them up into chunky salsa, except..." There was a brief scuffle in the background as Amy explained to Twitch that interrupting was very rude. After a few seconds, Nubby awkwardly cleared his throat and continued the story. "Except after that, all the bits and stuff started running together and they got back up." "Oh, shit." Amy's voice returned. "But then we dewarped and they all sort of evaporated. Just poof, gone. Blood and guts and everything, so we figured..." Once again, Twitch interrupted.
"That the Needs have formed an alliance with Chaos, and an unstoppable tide of demonids will swarm across the sector, and
Sarge sighed and rubbed his face as Tink and Nubby both snickered. "We figure it was just some sort of warp thingy, so I guess everything is fine. I mean, Fumbles is unconscious again, but otherwise everything is fine," finished Amy, sounding rather annoyed over how her story had been spoiled. Sarge ran through the whole disjointed report in his head. After a little pondering, he held up his hand and began ticking off his fingers. "Okay, I guess we dewarped just in time to avoid that problem, so that's sorted. And it looks like the anti-psyker stuff is holding up fine now that we're out of the warp. And Gravis is still mostly alive, right?" "Right, mostly," confirmed Doc. Sarge looked down at his closed hand in surprise, ran through a list in his head, then shrugged to himself. "So, I guess we made it. I mean, we're here at the way station, whatever. All that's left to do is requisition a few parts, drop Gravis off at the local Medicaid, get a new astropath, and call the sides. Then we spend a few leisurely weeks getting everything fixed up and take a nice safe route back to wherever Oak's lab is." He paused for a second, not quite believing what he was saying, then continued. "So yeah, we win. Good job, people." There were a few seconds of shocked disbelief, then Sarge ripped off his comm bead as it exploded with cheers. When the volume finally returned to a safe level, he put it back on just in time to catch Doc say, "You know, that trip went a lot easier than I expected." "Oh, shut up. You've been hiding in the medbay and sleeping in a nice warm bed every night," responded Tink in the most petulant of tone. "I can't remember the last time I got sleep for more than a few 10 minutes. Doc continued undeterred. "Okay, yeah, it was a bad week for some of us, I'll admit that, but it wasn't what I'd call hellish. And hellish is the sort of standard for our missions. I mean, when you look at it in comparison to some of the other assignments, this went amazingly well." That was met with a thoughtful silence, which then slowly congealed as the squad followed the observation out to its logical conclusion. Eventually, Twitch broke the uncomfortable silence. "Oh, we are so screwed. This one's gonna be really, really bad." "What's going to be bad?" asked Amy, revealing her inexperience. "Everything." "What?" "It's like the third law of conservation of the thingy," translated Nubby. "You know, for everything that happens, there's a completely disproportionate reaction." Sarge sighed and translated the translation. "If your attack is going really well, it's an ambush." Wait, are you guys seriously suggesting that nothing can possibly go right? That anything good that happens to us is just a setup for something especially horrible? Yeah, that's right. Uh-huh. It's been scientifically proven." And over again, responded the rest of the squad in unison. "So what? There's some sort of all-powerful cosmic entity conspiring to make our lives as dangerous and miserable as possible for his own sick amusement?" Nubby nodded. "Something like that, or just, the universe itself." I think it's the orcs, muttered Twitch. Amy ran the last few months through her mind. That's surprisingly believable. Well, not the orc part, that's just retarded, but it makes sense. She paused and applied this theory to the current situation. Yeah, now that we finally reached it, I can totally see this way station being full of... She trailed off. Chaos-worshipping psychic mutants, suggested Twitch, waiting to capture hapless visitors and overwrite their minds with copies of their cult's leaders, or orcs disguised as chaos-worshipping. Twitch was interrupted as Sarge, recognizing an unproductive line of thought, cleared his throat and rather wearily addressed his troops. Paranoia aside, we're just here for a nice, simple supply run. Everyone put together your shopping lists and grab some rest while the captain takes care of docking. And please, let's try to get out of this without there being anyone blowing up the station or being arrested or assaulting someone or committing tech heresy or whatever it is you do to screw everything up, Doc.